Hi, folks. Welcome to Changing Minds. I'm your host, Joe Devlin. How many times you've been in a store, on a website, and trying to purchase something, only to give up halfway through because it's just too darn frustrating? Something's gotten in the way, made it just not worth your time and effort. I was online the other day trying to return an order, and I couldn't find the information. I couldn't find a way to contact them, and it was just unbelievably aggravating. In contrast, a couple months ago, I switched energy suppliers and I expected it to be a real hassle, but they had taken a really customer centric perspective on things, and it was a breeze. And I was absolutely impressed. Taking that customer experience seriously is really important, but it's also really hard to do, right? So it's key to understanding your products and services and building those relationships with your clients, but it's really challenging. Thankfully, my guest today is an expert in this. I'd like to welcome Tim Routledge, the founder of CX Lab and a self-professed neuroscience enthusiast. Welcome to Changing Minds, Tim.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me. Pleased to be here.
It's a real pleasure. I'm glad you could make it. Before we get started, I'd just like to invite our audience to ask any questions that they have for Tim by putting them up into the Q&A board. And you can do it any time during the session. We'll get to them in the last sort of 10 minutes or so. But if you come up with something before that, by all means, feel free to put it in the Q&A board, and hopefully we'll get to it when we get to that point. Tim, if you don't mind, I'd like to just start by asking you a little bit about your background. How'd you get interested in consumer experience, and what led you to create CX Lab?
So my background is in advertising. So I worked for some big advertising agencies for about 20 years. Ran an agency of my own for a little bit of time as well. And I think generally got a little bit frustrated with the whole scene in that we found it difficult to create advertising that kind of worked effectively all the time and had to justify to clients why it didn't. So I was lucky enough to be able to take some time out to do a bunch of research. And so kind of read a lot about neuroscience, psychology, to get to the background, if you like, the research as to why the way the human mind works, the human brain works, and how we might understand it better. And it was that kind of that I brought to bear, having done all that research, to create a whole bunch of different research tools, because it seemed to me that if you understood neuroscience and psychology, you wouldn't just be simply asking people questions. And that's what came together in CX Lab a couple of years ago. Started with my co-founder, also called Tim, makes it really easy for clients. And so we're trying to bring those research tools to bear for our client, what we do for our clients, to understand employee and customer experience in tremendous detail, and then to use what comes out of the research to design better experiences, not just for the people that have to go through them, so the employees and the customers, but also experiences that deliver commercial returns for businesses. And that's what we do. That's what we're all about, really.
Fantastic. And I described you in the introduction as a self-professed neuroscience enthusiast, and you sort of touched on that then. What is it about the brain that really interested you, and how do you use that?
Yeah, I'm a bit nervous about talking about the brain and the mind, Joe, in front of you, clearly, because I don't have your academic background. But I am absolutely a neuroscience nut. I'm really interested in the subject. I'm interested in our brains because obviously they drive everything we do. And our main interest kind of focuses on a particular theory of the brain, and you will know it far better than me, this idea of the Bayesian theory of the brain, that our brains are in effect very, very sophisticated predicting machines. Mm. So what we're doing second by second, millisecond by millisecond, in fact, is setting predictions about what's going to happen next, and then checking them. So to seeing whether those expectations are being met. Now, these setting of expectations and indeed the checking of the match is something that happens unconsciously. We're not actually aware of it, so I don't have to think about taking another breath or which step I take when I'm walking. It just happens automatically. But when something goes wrong, so when that expectation is confounded by the reality we experience, what's called in neuroscience a prediction error, we get a reaction. And the reaction is both in our brain and in our body. And it seems to be that lots of neurotransmitters are involved in that. So dopamine, serotonin, things like that. But also we get this physiological reaction, which makes it something that can be detected. And the reason that this happens, obviously, is so that we can say, oh, there was a mismatch. I have to attend to it. I have to switch my attention to pay attention to that moment, because otherwise I might make the same mistake again. And clearly, it's not so deadly in our modern environments, but 100,000 years ago, back on the savannah, when we get something wrong, it could be a killer. So it's all about survival, and therefore it's all very important. And one of the things to note is that when this unconscious indicator happens and breaks into our consciousness, we're not able to access the unconscious to understand exactly why it happened. So what we're left with is this slightly uncomfortable feeling that something's not right, and then we're forced to kind of post-rationalize that, to think about that, which is often why we make mistakes when we try and attribute facts to what actually happened, because we're not really aware of them. Does that kind of make sense?
It's perfect, right? And I really like that theory because it sort of flies in the face of what we would probably consider common sense, right? There's this feeling that what happens is there's the world outside and our brain is around sort of figuring it out and responding to it. Whereas you've just inverted it. And I agree with you. I think this is a really important theory, and say, yeah, there is a world outside, but what your brain's doing is trying to figure it out beforehand to be efficient and just make as many things subconscious as possible. And when it goes wrong, of course, it's important. It may be life-threatening. Hopefully, in these examples we talk about today, we're not going to talk about too many life-threatening things. How do you measure that response, Tim? You mentioned that it happens in the brain and in the body. What do you do to get a hold of it?
So yeah, so measuring the stuff in the brain is obviously fairly difficult. And again, you will know far better than me, Joe, that the best way of doing that is to slide someone inside an fMRI scanner and kind of measure their brain activity. What we're interested in doing is measuring kind of real people in the real world in real time. So we're looking for physiological changes in their response, things that are triggered by these moments in time that we call tripping points. And we measure them through, I guess, relatively simple physiological measures. So things like heart rate, electrodermal activity, which is, I'm sure people know, but the amount of kind of sweat on your skin is an indicator of arousal or change. We do skin temperature. We also look to measure the context that people are responding in, because one of the critical things is with a lot of these measures that we can measure when your heart rate goes up, we can measure when your ADA goes up, but that happens whether you're scared, which is negative arousal, or whether you're excited, which is a positive arousal. So they both go up. So if we don't understand the context of that, then we've got no real way of knowing what's happening to you. So we use kind of video, and that can be on the person themselves, or people can be videoed covertly. We use audio to kind of measure stress levels in voices as well, and also physical ethnographers, so people actually watching someone else, a bit cloak and dagger if you like, to see what they're doing and see the context, what's triggered that particular response in people. So we're looking for big changes, because that's what tripping points are, big changes in that arousal, and we're looking for what causes them in the real world. Now, because that context is important, we also measure things like how people are moving, and this idea of approach withdrawal. There's this motivational sense that sometimes when something's positive for you, you will move towards it, and these can be micro movements of the head, tiny little things that make a difference. There's even some evidence that you walk faster towards something that you like and faster away from something that you don't like, and also the actual way that you move. So there's some gait analysis, GAIT, how you actually walk seems to be different, again, dependent on the outcome that you're expecting from what's happening to you. So all these things can be put together to put together a really good picture of what changes that response. And these are the moments that we're looking for. These are the indicators of the tripping points and how they happen. If someone's actually doing an experience which is individual, which doesn't involve interaction with other people, we're able to do more brains imaging, or more brain scanning, if you like. So we have used EEG and something called FNIRS, which is functional near-infrared spectrography, which is again another measure which involves putting a headset on and measuring brain activity and displaying that. So we're able to do lots of different things. I've actually got one of the little devices that we use. It's literally
looks like a wristwatch.
Yeah, indeed. It's like a kind of Apple Watch, just a bit thicker, and it allows us to measure things. So what these new measurements, and they're getting smaller and better all the time. We've even got a ring now, which can actually measure from your finger, enabling us to do things in very simply, put on people. They're not aware that they're wearing the devices. They forget very quickly. So we can get a real look at real-time real world reactions to situations, which is obviously key to us because we're taking things out of the lab and putting them into what scientists call this ecologically valid world of the real world, where lots of other variables can come into effect. But again, we're looking for these really big changes to hone in on, to say, that looks like a tripping point. How do we understand what's happening there?
I love that idea of using multiple measures and sort of triangulating, because none of the tools themselves give you everything that you want. Can you give us an example of how you would use like tripping point theory in a real world ecologically valid case?
Well, we certainly do our best to make it ecologically valid, and clearly there's some constraints on that. But I guess a good example is we did some work for Honda in the UK to look at the car buying and the car servicing experience. So they were interested to understand what goes wrong in that experience. And any of you who've kind of ever bought a car maybe sort of saying, "Oh my God, at this moment, yeah, I could help Tim Routledge because I know all the things that go wrong in that experience." But we wanted to, get to the bottom of that in this kind of psychophysiological way, as it's called. And so we were able to put these devices on people while they went through real shopping experiences, and they didn't know who we were working for. In fact, they didn't even know that we were doing that kind of research. So we weren't priming them in effect to behave in a slightly different way. And what emerged from that was a whole bunch of tripping points against through both the car sales and the car servicing experience that enabled us to put together this customer journey, if you like, full of the kind of things that went wrong. And there were a lot of them. And, some of them were kind of big things, some were small. A lot of them involved interactions with the staff. A lot of them involved where process and technology let people down. So it wasn't intuitive, or it didn't seem to fit the moment. And there were problems with the environment itself, the showroom that people kind of went through and walked through. And we were able to look at those kind of elements as well and see how much contribution they made to the tripping points. And our solution to that, once we'd kind of done that investigative part and done some more detailed work on numbers to put big data behind it, was to introduce a training program which was helpful to staff so they could see where these moments occurred and what they could do about them, how they could literally head them off and avoid them in the first place, or if they did take place, how they could explain them better, how they could make their impact less dramatic, if you like. And we introduced a new technology which helped the process, made it smoother, and we made some tweaks and changes to the sensory elements within the showroom, which is a kind of fun part of what we do. So changing things which people are not consciously aware of, like smell and color, sound, music is key in the background. Things that we could alter to make that customer journey smoother with less of these kind of tripping points in them. And because that's our evidence that the more tripping points you get, the more likely it is that you won't go through with the things in the first place. So we did it in car sales first. We had some pretty interesting results.
Well, I was going to ask, could Honda see a difference in the bottom line or customer satisfaction, or what were the measures?
Absolutely. So we had a lot of KPIs, as you can imagine, a big company with a lot of KPIs on different things. And the most important ones to us were about sales themselves. And indeed, for people that we would work with, and car dealers themselves, all they're interested in doing is, are you moving the needle of sales? And we were able to see some dramatic, in fact, improvements in them, in the dealers that we work with, up to about 30% sales, and profit improvements as well, which again is good for the business. But what we were most interested in was what impact it had on the staff. And interestingly, staff retention rates also kind of went up because people were able to do their job more efficiently. They enjoyed it more because they're having less hassle with customers and they're being more successful. So that worked. And also customer satisfaction scores also went up, which is kind of what we would expect because things are better. So yeah, we had some very good impact, and then we switched on to service from sales and had similar kind of rises in performance in terms of sales and things like that, which is great, very satisfying. It provides obviously very good case study for us to talk about on things like this, about how things work.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, are tripping points, I mean, are they all or nothing, or can you have bigger and smaller tripping points? Like, can you grade it a little bit? And if so, is that a useful distinction, or not really?
That's a really good question, and it's absolutely true. So there are different kinds of tripping points. and we sort of have our kind of little phrases to describe them. So there are clearly things that are very, very big tripping points. You know, we call them a slap in the face. So this idea, and we saw it in Honda quite a lot, where people just arrived at a showroom and weren't able to park in the car park, and a lot of people might have experienced that. Okay. And of course, you know, someone's not even coming through your door. All this £1 million of experience that you've created for them is never get used because people just can't make it there. So clearly, those things are big problems. Yeah. But there are also lots of small tripping points which seem relatively insignificant, but grouped together can become this kind of constant irritant which drives people away. And we call these the dripping tap. So it's just something annoying, keeps going wrong. The salesman hasn't got a pen when I've got to sign a document. They didn't seem to be so sure about the price of my car or things like that. And all these things serve to make us feel a little bit more and more uncomfortable. And at some point, the straw breaks the camel's back and we just go, that's it, kind of, right. I'm out. But of course, we're not really able to consciously understand what those different things were. We just got to a point where we thought, this is not for me. So yes, this idea of different tripping points and understanding people's different differential reactions to them is really important. It's all about tolerance for those things. So what we find, and this is quite interesting, I think, is that existing customers actually, in some cases, tend to be less tolerant of tripping points than new customers.
Surprising.
Because, yeah, it seems counterintuitive, but then that's because they have very set expectations about what's going to happen next because they're with you. And so therefore, when things happen to confound those, they get really upset. Whereas new customers are kind of going, yeah, this is all a bit new to me. They're setting their expectations already. So they might be a little bit more tolerant. That's not always true. So again, it depends on the product or the service that we're dealing with. But there are some really interesting things to uncover about the different gradings of tripping points.
And do you see lots of cases where there's a real difference between what people sort of self-report and tell you and what they actually, what you can measure using, you know, the wristwatch or the physiology?
Yeah, that's always something that we try and do within our studies, is to ask people at the same time or subsequently in a conventional way after we've done our physiological measurements. And it's always interesting to see the differences. And I guess one of the best examples is we were actually asked by a particular organization, Virgin Atlantic, to have a look at their upper class experience in their, you know, it's a very nice experience. Joe, I'm sure you've experienced it many times.
I wouldn't know. Yeah.
Because and their question to us was quite an interesting one. So normally we're asked to look at kind of, you know, what are the most important things within our experience and what's good and where are the bad bits. But what they wanted to do was to look at what was the least important, because they were all about saving money. I can actually share, I've got a couple of slides, Joe, if that helps.
Yeah, that would be great if you could share.
Yeah, if I just kind of go through to this, we'll see if it works. How are we doing? Oh, not bad.
Perfect.
Is that good? Yeah.
Yes.
Good for me. So they have a bunch of elements that make up their kind of experience within this upper class cabin, and they're all very nice. Things like the pre-flight experience where you go to this particular lounge at Heathrow or in New York, which is great. The food's obviously a bit special, that stuff. But all these things are obviously very expensive to deliver. And Virgin spent quite a bit of time with conventional research asking people questions. So how would you rate, you know, these different elements? They've done lots of very complicated studies using what's called regression analysis to understand in more detail how people have made the decisions. And they came up with kind of this list, if you like, of a league table of where these things fell. And there you can see a representation of it, you know, kind of what's most important and what's least important, with that, the good old amenity kit sitting right at the bottom there. You know, you get your pajamas and your nice headphones and stuff.
Right.
But they weren't sort of absolutely sure about this, convinced by this. So they asked us to kind of carry out one of our sort of studies. And we did that, again, through all different parts of the experience. And what we saw was a league table that was very, very different. Very different, where you can see the amenity kit moves a lot higher up the
I'm surprised, actually.
Yeah, it's so this, I guess this is about how people felt, and the other one was about, you know, what they thought. And there's obviously a critical difference, as we can see here, because the thing here that fell at the very bottom of the list is this kind of in-flight massage service, beauty service, which it had been seen as a pretty key part of the Virgin offering. It made it different from British Airways and some of the other providers. And I believe it was actually Mrs. Branson's idea to introduce it in the first place. So it clearly held quite a lot of
cachet, yeah.
importance for the marketeers working on the brand. But kind of following our advice, they decided to do away with that part of the experience, and they saved themselves £10 million a year in the process, which seems like a pretty good number, and it holds up very well when they actually found it had zero impact on the number of people who were buying tickets. So what's called the load factor. So it didn't seem to detract in any way from the experience because, again, customer satisfaction scores didn't change. So we took something which had been seen as critical away, made no difference to the business and no difference to customers, but actually they saved an awful lot of money as a result. So that's another thing you're able to do with it, is to create a hierarchy, if you like, of what matters most, both in terms of good things about the experience and indeed bad things about the experience, those tripping points that we were talking about before.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant, right? I mean, to be able to not only save money, but to not have a negative impact on sales and customer experience is, that's sort of the optimal outcome.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it was a good process. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Cool. We'll go back to full size.
Yeah.
Maybe one more quick question then before we turn to the audience, and
Sure.
that is, we're talking about these, and even the name tripping points sort of suggests that they're negative. Is there any point or any time when you could use tripping points to actually improve a customer experience? Is that even a sensible question?
Yeah, it is. And I think what I didn't explain before is that tripping points can be positive or negative, because any mismatch between your expectation and reality is a tripping point, and creates that reaction we talked about unconsciously and consciously. So what's interesting is we did some work for the National Lottery to kind of illustrate this, and we looked at the online ticket buying experience, and there were clearly some moments in the online process that go wrong where you find it difficult to enter your details or whatever that stuff. So these were tripping points, and we suggested them that they obviously get rid of those things, and they wanted to make the journey as absolutely frictionless as possible with nothing happening. We said to them, we think that's a bit of a mistake, because you don't want buying a lottery ticket to be like buying a train ticket, because there needs to be something in the lottery experience to make you want to do it again. So our suggestion was that they would introduce some tripping points, some moments that would make people pay attention at specific parts of the journey, and in very specific ways that weren't too much, that didn't slow people down too much or upset them, but did make them concentrate, did improve this level of excitement and anticipation about what's going to happen next. So that took a bit of them getting used to, I think, because I think from an online and an IT perspective, it's just about, let's make it easy, but they went away and they re-engineered it based on some of the things we said. We tested some of those again, and then they introduced them, and they've since improved their, what they call the conversion rate, which is the number of people who register and actually play, which is a key thing for the lottery, because obviously it's about income, it's about money. They improved that conversion rate by 21%. So to your point, yes, understanding the correct use of tripping points in a positive or indeed a negative way is critical to getting the business that you want, depending on what the circumstances are. So.
Yeah, some really brilliant examples there of how understanding that customer journey in detail benefits the companies. But my guess is that it benefits the companies because it benefits the customers, right? I mean, you've made the journey more pleasant, more favorable for them.
Well, that's our belief, and obviously that's the thing that's most. We think of the thing as synonymous. Sometimes it's harder for businesses to understand still that the idea of improving the experience will improve the bottom line. We see a straight causal link between the two. Sometimes we need to convince people a little bit more.
Well, if it's okay with you, what I'd love to do is turn to some of the audience questions now. Is that all right?
Yeah, fine. Of course,
okay.
Yeah.
So one of the questions here is from Al, who's asking, do you measure people that gamble to see when they go over the boundary, when they're losing more than when they gain?
That's a great question. We've got a couple of provisional projects in place at the moment, looking at kind of problem gambling and that kind of thing. So
I've lost sound. Are you still there?
Have you lost me, Joe?
I'm with you. Sorry, the sound dropped out for a second.
Okay. Am I all good still? Yeah.
Good.
Excellent. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. Yeah, to look at problem gambling, and obviously it's for the lottery, it's also quite important to understand. And we believe that there are lots of kind of physiological markers that occur within the gambling process. And we think that there are some markers of problem gambling as opposed to kind of what might be called good gambling, which is, you know, you have a flutter a couple of times and that's all fine. So, yeah, I think in understanding that gambling process, we believe that we can identify some indicators that might help to create alerts, for example, for people who are problem gamblers that are triggered by their physiology or particularly by their behavior, because that's the point we want is, can we correlate behavior, what people do with what's happening inside them? And if we can, and then identify those markers of behavior, we might be able to use those markers to trigger these responses to help people. And to understand the difference as well. What makes a problem gambler a problem gambler? Does it tick over into a special place? Because I think gambling is really, really interesting, because obviously it's one of the few things where you can be addicted to it, and it's not a physical substance. It's not a thing. It's all in your brain. So yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's a question here from Dave asking, what about the opposite of tripping points? Where people get confirmation of their expectations, can you measure the impact of those?
Well, so what you see in the physiology with that is you don't see a tripping point.
Oh, right.
So that means it's a good thing. So if expectations are not confounded, then that is a good thing in terms of brain optimization. So it means for the brain, it's like a big green light. This is all fine. Exactly what I expected. Go, go, go. And in an ideal world, that's what you might want. Apart, of course, from the lottery example, where you want to create some little moments that people think about. So when we don't see the physiology changing, then generally people are on the right track and things are good.
Fantastic.
So yeah, I think that's answering Dave's question.
Sure. Yeah. And there's a question here, which if you're comfortable answering, they're asking about projects that you're currently working on. Can you share anything that you're currently active with?
Well, the gambling thing is hopefully upcoming. There's another interesting project that we're really excited about getting going, which is looking at employee experience specifically. So trying to use the kind of devices that I've talked about to measure employee experience on a mass scale. And on a mass scale, I'm talking about hundreds, thousands of people. To try and understand the correlation again of what happens to them and their physiology, and how that relates to performance in terms of the output that they have for the business in their lives, and indeed how that impacts on some business KPIs like sales profit and productivity, which is a critical one. We think we can also use that to identify markers of potential mental health issues arising, particularly because it's about monitoring stress. And we're working with some guys at UCL, actually, Joe, to try and bring that together, which is going to be very exciting. And we think that by combining the physiology with kind of really, really big data about what's happening in those businesses that these people work for, we can not only make individual improvements to people by suggesting to them where things are going wrong and how they might better manage the stress they experience, whether that be at work or at home, but also on this organizational level to say, actually, you need to do some fundamental things to do with your working practices and working from home. And some of this might be triggered indeed by kind of what's happening with COVID right now, how they might alter things to reduce the stress on their workforce and therefore improve their productivity. So again, getting people to recognize that there's this direct causal link between our internal physiology and our professional output, if you like.
Sure. And again, it seems like there are obvious advantages in reducing stress levels and things like that for your employees, but the implication is that this will actually have bottom line improvements as well. The companies will see this isn't just done for the benefit of their employees, although that's a perfectly valid thing.
No, of course. And that's interesting, isn't it? That when you read about the impact of mental health issues and stress issues on individuals, lots of big numbers are always talked about in terms of how the productivity of the country, the burden on the NHS, lots of really big numbers are talked about. But no one yet understands how those things are directly related. What we're able to say is that lots of people are stressed. And again, Joe, better than me, this is a correlation, right? Lots of people are stressed and productivity seems to be going down. So, let's do something about this and this will go up. But we want to understand this black box in the middle. What happens? What levers, what triggers can we pull? What interventions can we make that make those things directly relatable? And therefore, by reducing stress, we can drive productivity and indeed reduce burden on NHS. So there's a societal benefit to the whole thing. And that's what makes it most exciting, is that it's a real application of kind of neuroscience in society for real people, making a real difference to them.
Excellent. Well, I think we should probably stop there. I'm sensitive to the time. There were a whole slew of questions that we didn't get to, and that's my fault. I should have kept things moving a little faster. My apologies. Tim, would it be okay if people had questions, if they got in touch with you?
Absolutely, Joe. Always happy to get people's ideas and opinions and questions. So yeah, they can contact me directly. My email is tr@cxlab.co.uk. So really straightforward. Or our website, cxlab.co.uk. You can do it via that.
Right. No,
sorry, I obviously talk too much as well, which is
no, it's all good. I saw your email on one of the slides that you shared earlier, so it's actually in the recording for anybody who didn't.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's on the slide, for sure. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I'd just love to thank you, Tim. Tim Routledge, founder or co-founder, excuse me, of CX Lab, for a really interesting, exciting discussion today. I loved how you can use neuroscience and apply it in these ecologically valid real-world situations, to really benefit both customers and companies. It's fantastic.
We believe that's the double whammy we're after, Joe. So, but thank you so much for having me. I hope people have enjoyed it, and look forward to answering people's questions. It'd be great. Thank you.
Perfect. Look, hopefully you can join us next week when we're going to be discussing the psychology of trust in brands, and it should be another fun discussion. So please join us next week, and I will see you then. Thanks very much.